It's time now to speak to Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. This week he wrote about something in yesterday's column about something I write about every year as well in mine. Why the heck do we change the clocks twice a year? Now, I know it's a fact that if they don't go back, and they hadn't gone back this weekend, then by sort of mid-November, Scotland and Northern Ireland would be waiting until getting on for 11 in the morning for full daylight. So it would be very, very dark there. So I can see that, obviously, fair enough. So this is my idea. Why not have two time zones? I mean, they manage with four very happily across the pond, don't they? Why can't Scotland, during the winter, go onto its own time zone and we stick with British summertime? So we keep the lighter evenings. Now, I argue for that because I actually enjoy having lighter evenings and I hate the darker mornings. But Peter, although we both agree that this is a mad system that started for reasons lost in history during the First World War and because of the Kaiser, but you think it should be the other way around. We should stick to what we've got as we speak. We should stick to winter time. Why?
It's not winter time. It's natural time. It's the time it applies to our portion of the earth. Time is real. Sunset, sunrise, and noon are actual events describing the relationship of the part of the Earth's surface on which you stand to the sun. And if you fiddle with it, you don't actually gain or lose anything. The whole idea that the evenings will be lighter or the mornings will be darker if you change the clocks is nonsense. The amount of daylight remains exactly the same, and the days shorten in the winter and they lengthen in the summer. You don't change that. All you do is you change the way people relate to the day by insisting that all the things which are timetabled, such as schools and workplaces, are suddenly demanding that everybody comes to work an hour earlier in March. And it's not 6 months, by the way, it's 7. The amount of time we spend on funny time is 7 months a year and not half of it. And if your employer wrote to you on Friday and said, the following Monday, I want you to come in an hour earlier, or if your children at school wrote to you and said, the following Monday, your children must come to school an hour earlier, you'd say, why? And you would quite possibly say no.
Yes.
But because this is done by forcing everyone to change their clocks, no one protests against it, and no one thinks about it. As with so many things, it's a solidified panic from 1916.
Yes, explain that. Explain that, Peter, because it started with the Kaiser, didn't it? The Kaiser was the person during the First War who did this with the clocks, something to do with industrial production, and the British government, surprise, surprise, panicked. not for the last time, and did the same. What were the roots of that? What was the logic in it?
The roots of it were, as with so many things, the great era of fads, the Edwardian era, when particularly two people, a man called William Willits and another called George Hudson, both had this fad about shifting the clocks. Willits was a property developer who didn't like the fact that other people got up later than him, and Hudson was a bug hunter in New Zealand who seemed to think that making other people get up earlier would give him more time to run around chasing insects in South Island. But the truth is that these were fads. They were fads like Esperanto and its brother world language Volapük, and wearing wool next to the skin, and knickerbockers, the sort of thing people really liked in the Edwardian era. They were campaigned for. It was actually voted on in Parliament in peacetime and thrown out as an absurdity. But wartime, of course, brings absurdities into being. And the Kaiser did indeed panic. Remember, 1916 was the nadir of the Second World War, when all the world, everybody felt they were not winning or losing. And it was put to him that he might be able to increase industrial production or reduce the consumption of coal by shoving the clocks forward by an hour. So he did so.
Right.
No evidence was ever produced for this, or as far as I know, nobody ever compiled any afterwards. It then lapsed. The British government then immediately copied this for fear that he was right. It then lapsed at the end of the war, and then for some reason was brought back. But again, if you look at the debates about this, you can't find any hard evidence. I don't think there has been. But we just do it. As I say, if you look at what actually happens, if you were a hermit living in a cottage somewhere with never watching any television, never taking any public transport, not going to work, having no children going to school, it wouldn't affect you in the slightest.
No.
The sun would come up and go down as it normally does, and you would live your life. But anybody who's connected to advanced civilization is immediately jolted by this forcing of the clocks forward in the spring into getting up an hour earlier. And several people die of heart attacks each year in Britain as a result of this, because it's very like jet lag, and it makes people ill. It's straightforwardly unnatural. I think you can, if anybody wants to get up an hour earlier, that's their business.
Yeah.
But forcing other people to get up an hour earlier, unless perhaps they're indolent teenagers, seems to me to be something the rest of us shouldn't do.
Well, let's come to the three-letter question word of the day, really, and it has been since March, and it gets bigger and bigger every day. Why? I mean, we'll come on to this. Why are we having the lockdowns, which don't work? Why has Wales gone crazy, or the senior minister of Wales gone crazy, and made these ludicrous, draconian, dystopian bans on certain types of shopping in shops that are otherwise open for business? Just extraordinary. And just to bring it back to this before we move on, why do we still move the clocks? What's in it for anybody?
It's panic in both cases, and panic can solidify into habit. As it has done with the clocks. We still do something which is based on a panic which we borrowed from the German Empire in 1916 every year. And nobody ever asks why. And the other thing is there are quite a lot of people who are volubly in favor of it, who tend to be media and political types living in London, who have no idea what the morning is like because they get up late, who never see the dawn except on their way back from a particularly good party.
Yep.
Who have no. You mentioned about darkness in Scotland. If we had the clocks forward where these maniacs want them to be all through the winter, then it wouldn't start getting light in London until 9. It's not just Scotland that's affected. It goes right the way down. And Spain to this day, because General Franco wanted to suck up to Hitler, they have their clocks jammed on an hour ahead of where they should be, and it completely skews society. It's particularly hard for children in summer, going to bed late and getting up early, and it leads to all kinds of problems. Portugal abandoned it for that reason.
Okay,
panic is common in human society, and sort of flock instinct of rushing into false solutions for non-existent problems, and that's exactly where we are. With the COVID episode.
Peter, I can, other than where we should let the clocks rest, I can find no reason to disagree with a syllable of what you said. I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting that Boris Johnson, before he was Prime Minister, when he was still a Telegraph columnist, wrote a huge piece about this, agreeing with you about 2 years ago. But no sign that he's carrying into policy what he wrote as a journalist and a columnist. But hey,
if he said that as a columnist, we can expect at any moment to have the clocks thrust forward 3 hours.
All right, let's move on to
There's no relation between the political Johnson to the journalist Johnson at all.
No. Let's move on to the position in Wales. I'd like to present you with a little fantasy, a little scenario. If I could put you into a locked room for 5 or 10 minutes with Mr. Drakesford, the First Minister of Wales, what would you say to him?
Well, I'd say to him what I say to all the proponents of this stuff: is your action proportionate to the problem? Have you actually studied it, or have you been stampeded by fear and by fear of responsibility into doing something you never ought to have done, and oughtn't you to admit that a mistake's been made? Because this has been what I've been saying actually since March the 14th in my column in the Mail on Sunday. We've got this out of proportion. Yes, there's a problem. Yes, COVID-19 kills people. Yes, that's very sad. But it's not as big a problem as we stated it is, and the actions being proposed against it have not been effective. There's a tremendous piece, which absolutely earth-shaking, actually, by Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, on his blog currently, which I urge everybody to read, showing definitively that the idea that the National Health Service was about to be overwhelmed in March and April of this year is completely provably false. The statistics show that it simply was not so. What we also know is that there's no evidence whatsoever that the shutdowns which have been imposed have actually halted or slowed the spread of the disease in any meaningful way. But the costs, the measurable costs of this to the economy, to small business, to employment, to the gigantic government debt, which I promise you we will all have to pay in some way eventually, have been measurably enormous. And it's a simple lack of proportion, and also a panic and an unwillingness to admit a mistake. And I think we should forgive people who admit mistakes.
I agree.
But only up to a point. I think the moment has come where those politicians who continue to cling to this failed prescription for a grossly exaggerated problem have now reached the point where their refusal to consider a very serious scientific opposition to what they're doing, as well as political opposition, it has reached the point where they really do need to be removed from office. call democratic opportunity. And in the time between that now and their removal, they have to admit that their mistake and have to start putting.
Well, yes, dream on, Peter, dream on. Listen, I have to be honest. I came to lockdown skepticism a little bit later than you. I don't think for me the light bulb went on until about June, and it's been getting brighter and brighter ever since, because it's so obvious that back in March when we had the initial lockdown, I supported it. I bought the line that we had to protect the NHS and save lives and all of that. And to some extent, I still do back then, with hindsight. But we knew nothing about the virus then, very little. We didn't know which were the target groups, which were the vulnerable groups, which was the great majority that wasn't going to be seriously affected by it. We didn't know any of that. So we had a blunderbuss.
I dispute some of what you've said. What the thing was, there were indeed a lot of things that we did not know. Mm-hmm. We didn't know really the case fatality rate and things like that, but exaggerations were being put about, which were easily dispelled. And the work of Professor John Ioannidis of Stanford, for instance, made it clear that there was a strong possibility we were overestimating the danger and also overestimating the widespread nature of the effect of the disease. There was nothing that I wrote in March that you couldn't have written or said as well from looking to see what was going on.
All right, be that as it may. I take your point, but let's just move it on, because I'll put this question to you. We've learned so much more about the way the virus behaves, as I said, who's at risk and who's not at risk, and we have much more intelligence now. If we were fighting a war, you would call it a massing of intelligence across the desk. So why are we still playing hide and seek? Because that was my analogy when the light bulb went on. We're playing hide and seek with the virus, with lockdown. We go and hide in the wardrobe, we dive under the covers, and when we come out, surprise, surprise, it's still there, and it gets us again, and cases go up, and we have to dive under the covers again, and it's ridiculous. And a way to make us do that, it's not just that the government is in a state of panic, and has been since Professor Ferguson's ludicrous model back in March. It's also the case that they're spinning the panic. And I said this earlier on the programme, I've written about this in my column. Why do we have this tier system of lockdown in this country, which doesn't start at low, go to medium and then high, but starts at medium, goes to high and finishes on very high? I've never known a mechanical device which has those kinds of settings that doesn't begin with low and end with high, but they start halfway up the scale. They're treating us like a rather cruel nanny would treat a rather dim child. It's extraordinary, the contempt that's being shown to us. Do they think we don't get this kind of spin?
Well, a lot of people are in fact successfully spun, and the Daily Telegraph has an article today about the vast sums of money which has been spent on spinning the population. Very slick propaganda and hidden persuasion that's been going on from the start. I think there are people in the government who, once this got going, felt that they began to enjoy the power which it was giving them, and they were distilling power out of fear. And what ought to be famous sage minutes, which show that this was actually discussed, making people more frightened, are the most extraordinary public documents revealed probably in my lifetime, of a government admitting that it was up to this. But the tier stuff, I think, is a result of a compromise in government between those who would wish to shut the entire country down and reduce the economy to the level of Antarctica, and those who in the government who are at least intelligent enough to see that would be catastrophic beyond belief. There is a very limited area of intelligence in the government, and it's comparative. I mean, people in the government who one would describe as intelligent ministers would possibly not qualify as intelligent human beings, but there are enough people, particularly in the Treasury, who can see that the economic consequences of this are increasingly catastrophic. The destruction of businesses and jobs, the sinking of the country into the depths of unbelievable debt not previously seen in peacetime, really are alarming, even to those who don't grasp the details of the disease. So that's the reason for the tier stuff. Some people want to shut the country down again. Some people realize this would be mad. And so they came up with the tier system to come to fall halfway between total madness and semi-madness.
I'd like to bring you to something that we touched on a bit earlier in this program. I was listening. I flit around the talk radio stations, including this one. And on Saturday, I happened to catch the last 20 minutes or so of the Today program on Radio 4. And they were interviewing a scientist, a professor. He was talking about the virus, and he was talking about the future and Christmas and and lockdown. And he wasn't saying anything particularly sort of interesting, but he was on and being treated with great deference. And I didn't recognise his voice. And when the presenter signed off, it was only Professor Neil Ferguson Ferguson from Imperial College, the guy who had to resign from Sage because he broke his own lockdown rules, the guy whose previous predictions about pandemics, going back decades, have almost entirely been entirely wrong, and yet he's still being trotted out on mainstream media as somebody that we should listen to, and he's still apparently giving advice to the government, not via Sage, but from his position at Imperial College. What do you make of that?
Well, it's an example of how closed the minds of government are. And there are, as I say, the very highly qualified scientists in the same field as Professor Ferguson, notably Professor Sunetra Gupta of the University of Oxford, who have from the very beginning urged a different attitude. And of course, there's Anders Tegnell in Sweden, who has shown that there are other ways of tackling this which are nothing like as damaging to the economy and society. The government has been told of their existence, and I think has been gently introduced to them, but doesn't really, because it's unable to admit to having made its mistake, it still doesn't really listen to them. The BBC is even worse. And the BBC, in my view, I've now reached the conclusion that the only thing that a rational country of this kind would do is to close down the BBC and replace it with a new organisation, because it has simply breached its charter and agreement, which requires it to be impartial on matters of public controversy. It has not given any kind of fair representation to highly qualified opponents of this policy from the start. It has acted as a government propaganda organ, and I'm afraid it has to be dissolved. I mean, many of the people in it would presumably be rehired afterwards by a new organisation, but as the BBC, it is so discredited now that I, who have for many, many years been almost alone among conservatives in saying we need a national broadcaster and we need the licence fee, have actually come to the conclusion that the BBC itself, as it now stands, should be shut down and replaced.
All right, we've got about
it should be a proper national broadcaster.
Yeah. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left, Peter, and I'd like to kind of move into crystal ball territory. We do seem to be seeing signs of a breakdown in the public willingness to go along with the whole lockdown scenario. We're seeing a massive petition by Welsh standards in terms of the population in Wales against this nonsense of denying them the right to buy what they want to buy in their local supermarket. That is clearly absurd. And the signs of a U-turn there. We're seeing signs of a U-turn on the 14-day quarantine rule. That could be down to 10 or 7, not because of the science. Nothing's changed there, but because people simply aren't obeying it, and therefore it's not working. And they think if they make it shorter, then more people might be minded to stick in house arrest for 7 days rather than giving up and going out because it's going to be 14. So all that's based on public pushing back for the first time. It's actually the dynamic is changing. From the grumpy assent that we've had up to now, we're getting rebellion. We're getting that wonderful pensioner, an 83-year-old in Rochdale last week saying basically, sod off, I'm not doing it. Do you, crystal ball gazing time now, do you think that maybe by post-Christmas, January, February, the lockdown that we've been enduring for so long will be an abandoned strategy? They'll have to let go because the public simply won't wear it.
I doubt they'll let go of it because they have it as a fixed idea, and I think they're unshiftable. And this is I very much fear that the result will be increasing resistance as government by consent effectively cease to exist and is becoming government by decree. And this is a result of the grave irresponsibility of the parliamentary opposition, which is not opposed, of members of parliament who have not criticised or scrutinised, of much of the media who've not done their job, and of the courts, which have so far more or less refused to countenance any challenge to this. None of the safety valves in our society are functioning. They've all been sealed. And if you seal the safety valves, eventually the boiler bursts. And that will be very unpleasant when it happens. I hope very much that it won't happen. And I beg of those people who've so far refused completely to listen to dissent to start listening to it and acting on it now, for fear of what may happen if they continue to try and keep the country under a regime which is frankly intolerable. There won't be an intellectual revolt against this. There will just be a public loss of patience, which is terribly dangerous to the rule of law and civil peace. And I think we need to fear this. And those who understand this should begin to realize, do your job, the opposition, do your job, members of parliament, do your job, the courts, do your job, the media. Stop sitting around not doing what you're supposed to do. Act as the safety valve you should be in a proper civil society.
And very briefly, Peter, to move away from the metaphor and on to something more explicit, when you say the boiler will burst, and I agree with you, what do you mean by that specifically?
I don't know exactly what shape it will take,
no.
But I very much fear it. I've seen a lot of civil disorder in my life, and I don't want to see any more. Absolutely, I'm more committed to the rule of law than I am probably to any other concept of government. And I think these idiots who fail to do their jobs, particularly the leader of the opposition and members of parliament and the courts and large parts of the completely biased media who closed their minds to opposition for so long. These people must now act.
Yep.
The time has come to act now to open those safety valves for fear of what might happen. I can't tell what it might be, but if you play this long, if you for this long you treat a population with contempt and take away their liberties and take away their jobs and their livelihoods, what do you expect will happen? Everyone will come out and wave flowers?
I somehow doubt that.